Today I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I'm just going to kind of ramble about a topic that is interesting to me, and that's the physical infrastructure of some of these neighborhoods, particularly the more abandoned, more derelict neighborhoods. Some people have asked me, some people who aren't familiar with cities and abandoned buildings as much, they wonder how quickly things can fall apart, and are these buildings from, are they from the 100 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago? How long have they been abandoned? Um, an unsatisfying answer is that it really depends. Now, a lot of these in Baltimore were built kind of the early 1900s to about the mid 1900s. So for row houses, that's where a lot of them are from. And then just in terms of how quickly they fall apart, that just depends. If you have a fire, you can have a thriving street turn basically vacant overnight, especially with row houses being connected. You have a fire in one house, a lot of times you'll have a fire in 3 or 4 or 5 houses. On the other hand, if things are maintained, they can last 100, 150 years as long as they're getting maintenance. But in a lot of these neighborhoods, the financial incentives just aren't there to maintain houses, and that's why you'll see them fall apart. So, as discussed in the intro, today I'm going to take a look at a couple specific houses in Baltimore, and we can just look at a quick timeline of how quickly some of them can fall into disrepair. Now, this one on Wilkins Avenue in southwest Baltimore, just to give you an idea of where we're at, southwest Baltimore and Carrollton Ridge. I'm familiar with this one just because I drive past it all the time, and I've seen how quickly it's fallen apart. But so we're going to be looking at this blue house right here. And as you can see, it's obviously in terrible shape. It's probably not even safe to go in at this point. But you only need to go back 3, 4, 5 years, and it's a nice house. Granted, there's some rough looking houses next to it that have obviously been vacant for a very long time, given that they have trees growing out of them. But still, this one is in pretty decent shape. Now, unfortunately, sometime in 2018, it looks like there was a fire in this building and it had to be vacated, and it's been all downhill since then. It's hard to tell exactly how much damage this fire did at the time, but within 2 years, it's obviously fallen apart enough that that house isn't going to be repaired. I mean, the amount that it would cost to fix that kind of structural damage, in addition to whatever fire damage there is, that house will never be lived in again, unfortunately. And it only took a couple years. Now, another thing to note, and in this case, it's a little bit different because it looks like the fire actually originated in the occupied house. But one of the dangers of having all these vacant houses, and these are bad examples because no one's living in that, but in the vacant houses that are able to be lived in, you have this issue where squatters and people just looking for a place to stay will set up camp in them, and then they'll have their little campfires or their little crack pipes or whatever it is, and unfortunately they'll cause a fire. And that's very common, as you can see, just in this neighborhood, with houses across the street suffering a similar fate. Another thing to note, in Baltimore, you have the added danger of a lot of East Coast cities, particularly in the Northeast with Baltimore and Philadelphia and Camden and places like that, where you have such dense row houses. If you have a fire in one house, oftentimes that means you have a fire in 3 or 4 or 5 houses. So that's another just sort of quirk to the Northeast. And the problem is when you have something like this, it has that, no one wants to live on this block anymore because you have these 3, 4 houses that are derelict shells with all the bad things that come along with derelict housing shells. You have rats and you have whatever else goes on in houses. Those ones are probably a little too far gone to have anything going on in them, but ones like this where it's boarded up, but someone could still live in that. So all that to say, things can fall apart very quickly, unfortunately. And once they get past a certain point, here's another burned out shell. And once they get past that point, it's very difficult and very unlikely for them to turn around. And especially in neighborhoods like these where you could, if you have this, say you have this one burned out shell of a house right here, you could fix it up maybe 100, 150 grand, depending on how much structural damage there was. But it is possible to make it live-inable again. The problem is that this house right here is probably, if it's sold on the open market, would sell for 50 grand or 75 grand if it was nice. So it's just not worth it in these neighborhoods to put any money into any of these houses once they start to fall apart. And that the effect that that has on the surrounding houses is pretty unfortunate. So here we are looking at another example. This is on Fairmount Avenue, also in Southwest Baltimore, around Shipley Hill. This is another one that, this is 2009. We're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 houses. All of them appear to be lived in, or at the very least, they're not boarded up. 2009, then 2012 rolls around. You got 1, 2 boarded up. Another one from 2012. It looks like maybe a third one. Now you got, looks like still 3 as of 2017. And then now to close to present day, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as you can see, it's just an unfortunate thing that creeps through the blocks as one house starts to fall into disrepair. I mean, there's no denying that it has a knock-on effect. Not to say that it has to happen all the time. Some of the time, people do remarkably good renovation projects and are able to turn a block around. Like, actually, that looked like this one. There's an example of one that, I mean, at the very least from the outside, it looks like they did a lot. My question is, with a vacant right next door, a vacant right there, a vacant right there, how long will this one stay in that nice of shape? And I don't ask that to be mean, but it's just a question that, I mean, you have to be realistic. Is that house going to last in that shape very long, given it looks like might be the same person did this one and this one? And I mean, I love to see it. Don't get me wrong. It's great to see houses being renovated, particularly like this is a block that looks like it's actually moving in the right direction, because you got this one was vacant, isn't vacant anymore. This one was vacant, isn't anymore. This one was vacant, isn't anymore. So it can go the other way too. It just seems like, in my experience, more often than not, things move in the wrong direction as opposed to moving in the direction that this block appears to be headed. So that's all I think I'm going to talk about for today. Just interesting to see the way these neighborhoods change over the years and how quickly they can. Sometimes, like here's one. What do we got going on? This one actually might be under renovation as well. It looks like some new plywood, so it's a positive sign. But all of this to say, maintenance is important, and anything we can do to keep these neighborhoods from going past that tipping point where they're no longer financially viable for people to put money into. One thing that Baltimore, but a lot of cities do, but Baltimore in particular, has this reputation for being sort of a block-to-block kind of place where one block is rough, one's not. And I think a lot of that is just because you got the housing situation. If you have a couple of vacant, burned out shells, then it's gonna make people less likely to invest and try to make it a nice block. and then you end up with either a rundown block or you end up with this where it's just abandoned spots where houses used to be. So that's all I'm going to ramble about for now.